There we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Darlene Young, and I would like to welcome you all to part 2 of the Norwalk Public Library's One Book, One Community discussion of James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. I'm a proud resident of South Norwalk, where I've had the pleasure of working and collaborating with Sherelle Harris of the Norwalk Public Library, who is now the acting director, which is a great thumbs up for Ms. Harris, who was the children's librarian, head of the South Norwalk Library branch for many, many years, though she quietly served the city at large. Sherelle has another meeting tonight and unfortunately could not be with us, but knows that you all are going to do a fantastic job as you did in part 1. When working with busy and prominent people such as Sherelle and yourselves, schedules are full and difficult sometimes, and it's just hard to find a date that meets everybody's needs. And so we're just happy that you all are here again to participate in part 2. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to make part 1, but I heard it was fantastic and just love the idea that you all agree that there needs to be a part 2 and possibly a part 3 for something else, but this definitely needs to continue. And so I just want to congratulate all of you for being a part of this kind of groundbreaking kind of conversation. I don't know if it's ever happened, or how often it's happened in the city of Norwalk, but we welcome you and welcome all the folks who joined us this evening. So we're going to start off, but before I introduce all of you on the panel, I would like to introduce Ms. Karen Thorson. Did I say that right, Ms. Karen?
Thorson.
Who with her husband, Doug, founded the James Baldwin Project. Sherelle collaborated with you two in the past and has invited you all back to Norwalk, and so happy that you graciously accept her invitation. You should be able to see Karen's bio on the screen. And I will give a few seconds for you all to read her bio as Karen prepares to say a few words on behalf of the project. And as Shelley sets up the short clip about Baldwin for those of us who weren't able to participate in part 1.
While you're reading, I don't want to take up much of your time. That's not what matters. I really am a conduit for something far more important than my own identity. And that is what Baldwin taught me. He changed my life. And I ended up making a film that has become what's known as an evergreen or a classic, James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket. It's his basically a biography and a literary exploration of his life. But the main thing is we've taken some excerpts from that film, and you're about to see a 5-minute clip that introduces what books meant to Jimmy. I think that's appropriate because this is the Norwalk Public Library, after all, hosting this. What books meant to Jimmy and how that changed his life, and how he found through books, through writing, through reading, what he shared with all of humanity.
Thank you. Okay.
You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me the most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive or who had ever been alive. I went to the 135th Street Library at least 3 or 4 times a week. And I read everything there. I mean, every single book in that library. I knew that what was happening in those books was also happening all around me. And I was trying to make a connection between the books and the life I saw and the life I lived. I knew I was black, of course, but I also knew I was smart. I didn't know how I would use my mind, or even if I could. But that was the only thing I had to use. And I was going to get whatever I wanted that way. So I watched school where I watched the streets, because part of the answer was there.
He's not even teaching me about the future of my people. What you going to school for then, Tommy? We don't even have a country. I know that. Do we have a country? He said United States is your country, which is not your country. You have no flag, brother.
A boy last week, he was 16, told me on television. Thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now, he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really it is held together, by the love and the passion of very few people.
Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able to end the racial nightmare and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything. The fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in songs by former slaves, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire next time.
It is not a romantic matter. It is the unutterable truth. All men are brothers. That's the bottom line. If you can't take it from there, you can't take it at all. A day will come when you will trust you more than you do now. When you trust me more than you do now. We can trust each other. I do believe that we can all become better than we are. I know we can.
Thank you for showing that clip. I have to say that is so extremely powerful. And this is not in the script I was given. Terrell knows me better than that. You could put 2020 on that. And that's why we're here today. And I'm just ready to have this conversation. So we will begin this discussion of James Baldwin's Fire Next Time. So first, Brandon McGee could not be with us today. Ms. Sherelle Harris thought that he would, and something has come up and he is no longer available to be with us physically, but I hope he is with us spiritually, which I'm sure he's upset he's missed this event. So now that brings us to Dr. Estrella. So I'm going to introduce everyone. So we have Dr. Estrella, our esteemed new superintendent, who I must say, for anyone to have come in to any position and that's working right now during COVID, um, my heart is with you. We are all going through something, and to be able to, and to have the responsibility of providing education for all of our children in a time like this is just overwhelming. And so she is here with us. I think so. Is she, Shelley?
I haven't found her yet. I'm sorry.
Okay, I don't see her name, but hopefully she will be with us.
Yes, she will be signing in. She's running a little late. She left Norwalk
Thank
a
you
little
so
later.
much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Diana.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
And next we have Jalen Seed. We bring him in on a close shot. So Mr. Seed is a lifelong Norwalk resident who is a father, is married, and has one son, I believe, right? It's a young man, love it. And he's a dedicated community activist. But I have to share with you that I also run the Marriage Summer Youth Employment Program. And I had Jalen Seed in my program. I won't say how old you are now. You might want to say that, but I had you in my program when you were 14, 15, 16, Jalen?
15.
Yeah, 15. And I have to say this. He probably worked in the program for about 3 years. Sherelle's going to kill me because I'm going off script a little bit. But he was in the program and worked for an organization that hired him. And Jalen Seed created his own organization at the tender age of what, 17? 18?
16.
You did amazing. 16. He's a shining star then, and he's shining even brighter now. And so, well, lovely. I'm glad that you are here, part of this. We have Pastor Liz on the screen, in the panel. So Reverend Liz Abel, also known as Pastor Liz, has a master's degree in social work from Columbia University, and is pastor of Cornerstone Community Church, United Methodist Church here in Norwalk. Pastor Liz hit the ground running and hasn't stopped since. And we so appreciate her dedication to the city of Norwalk. And I'm going to toot the horn for her. You might have said this last time, I don't know, but Pastor Liz has been coordinating the food distribution in Norwalk for the past 3-4 months, Pastor Liz, or more. And so that's what we mean when we talk about people coming in and doing what they need to do during a time like this. So we so appreciate you coming to Norwalk. Next, we have Elijah Manning. Mr. Manning is also a husband and father of 2, who's dedicated to bringing change to our school curriculum. Well, I'm glad to meet you, Mr. Manning. I think I've heard your name before, but welcome back to this important conversation. And next we have Farah. And finally, as Sherelle says, last but not least, but I would have said the same thing too, we have this Farah Marin, a Norwalk native who also has the degree, master's in social work from Columbia University. And she's also dedicated to anti-racist and community healing and education. And again, Farah, were you in the program? She was one of my summer youth employment program participants. I love my job because I love to see these young people and through their stages of life. So welcome, Farah. And all right, so now you have met the amazing panelists. For those of you who are new to this tonight, that we have that are going to talk about part 2 and finish this necessary discussion. To recap last month's discussion, the group discussed their favorite passage or theme in the book, religion yesterday and today, and integration. So if you missed the last discussion, you can subscribe. You can subscribe to the Sono Branch Library's YouTube channel and view it there. The link will be typed into the chat box for your convenience. Is that right, Shelley? Okay.
Yes, it's on the chat box.
And this part 2 presentation is also on Facebook Live. So now we are going to get started with the questions. And we're going to start off with Mr. Nick Saccinelli. And Nick Saccinelli is on the city's Common Council, and he is the Common Council president. And he will ask the first question. And each panelist will have 3 minutes to respond to the question. And we'll have a 10-minute Q&A before we move on to the next topic. So any of you can please type your question into the chat box. But as I think we kind of are going to change the flow just a bit, not everyone has to answer that question, particularly if you feel like someone has already kind of presented your viewpoint. So we're going to get started with that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nick Saccinelli.
Thank you, Ms. Young. Good evening, everyone. To the panelists, I have a good question for you here. How do you think 2020 compares to the 1960s in terms of white supremacy and systematic racism? Would you like me to go again?
I'll go first. I think the way that it compares is really, sadly, a lot has changed, but also a lot hasn't changed. In 1960s, you had the Birmingham church bombings. Of course, you had the assassination of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Now you had the Charleston church shooting, not in 2020, but 2016, I believe. And so not a lot has changed. And then also you have African Americans still being unlawfully killed by police officers and other people without even like the hope of justice, not even going to court. So when you look at stuff like that, not a lot has changed when it comes to white supremacy and systematic racism. Our kids still face an achievement gap being inside the school systems. Our people are still disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. So we have a lot of things that are happening. Of course, you can look at the positive side where we have more of our African-American young people are going to college and graduating from schools and starting businesses and different things. But when you look at like the core issues, I mean, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, where I was lucky enough to go to the March in Washington in August. And you see all the people, you see all the outcries. There were literally people that were handing out stickers of their loved ones that were like harassed or beaten or killed by the police or someone, where the news didn't pick up the stories. And these people from all over the country that this stuff was happening. So when you look at it that way, not a lot has changed that really has been able to give us that dream that Martin Luther King has been talking about. So we still have a lot of work to do.
And I'll jump on right on the tail end of that, as Pastor Liz, sorry, Elijah, beat you to it. I think when we read books like this, The Fire Next Time, and the context in which it was written, and it's so relevant today, is really, I think, what's startling to this generation of today. You know, many of us were not around for the March on Washington. We're not around during the 60s. I'm wearing my vintage 76 shirt. My mom was at the March on Washington, and she was a contemporary of John Lewis, and just the differences in the choices that they made and how they were going to respond to the acts of their community, I think is kind of where we are today. You know, there's a lot of stuff that's happening around us in our communities, and we each have an opportunity to make a decision about where we're going to stand, on the front line, on the sideline, behind the line, in the back room, and none of those places is the wrong place, just as long as we're all working towards something better, something where racial equity is across the board. So there's this conversation that's been happening about racial equality. And it's like, you know, equality is one thing, but when you talk about racial equity, getting to that place of equality is really where we need to be before we even start talking about equality. We need to get to a place where everybody needs to have an opportunity to speak and grow from their vantage point and help those who need a leg up or a leg down, and make sure that the playing field actually becomes more equal across the board for all people.
I think that the sad thing is that things haven't changed, but it's not just sad. It's Jim Crow by any other name. It's whether it's gerrymandering or giving someone a reading test in order to vote. This election is ample proof. But one thing that has changed is we have iPhones, and people are starting to see proof on screens of what they were able to ignore more readily before in their lives. And I hope that one uncomfortable fact will help propel change.
So there we go. Got it. So what I was going to say is, so we know Ruby Bridges, right? And I believe the year was 1960 when Ruby Bridges finally made it. She was 6 years old, so I believe it's 1960. I'm not 100%, but so if you look at that, and if you heard her speak recently, she also came out and said that the school she went to was integrated in 1960, but now that school is predominantly Black. So now we have to integrate it again. So we're having that same issue in a different way. Before it was an all-white school. Now the whites have moved out of that area and moved out of that neighborhood and let the Black people have that school. But part of the drive that we all need to have is integration of school systems, because we know that there's such a discrepancy in monetary a lot of times because of the systemic barriers that are laid upon us. And if we can't even start by integrating those schools to give the children a proper education, to learn all in the same way, then in another how many ever years, we're going to have that same pattern continue to happen. So we haven't taken out the barriers that have led us to where we are now. So as they were saying, you know, certain things have been able to come out, but when you break it down and look at certain institutions in that way, you see a repeat of history. And we are in a moment now where we have to find a way to break that cycle.
So I really like that question, because I think to understand our present, we have to think about our past and really understand our past. And as we know, our nation's founders claimed that they believed in justice and liberty for all, and that they were all Christians and founded our country on religious freedom. But I think having chattel slavery contradicts all of that. We have to atone and claim what actually was done to Black folks in our country and what continues to happen to Black and brown folks in our country. And I don't think we can heal until we acknowledge this. So I think looking not only at 2020 and at 1960, we really have to look at the root of our history and who we are as a nation.
Thank you.
Is it okay if I say one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So like on the topic, like with like integration, that's a big issue. But I think like one of the other issues are like why are those kids being treated less than just because there aren't white kids in that school? So it's just like the white kid, we shouldn't have to make like other kids come to the school for kids to just get equal treatment. So it's just like, yeah, we want them to go to school and have that diverse education, but we shouldn't have to bring, like, even in Norwalk, we shouldn't have to bring kids from Rowayton and Cranberry to the school just for our kids to get attention. They should just be getting attention because they're students. So like even integration, even if we have a Black school, the problem shouldn't be that it's a Black school and we're going to get less resources. The problem is we're going to get less resources because it's a Black school. So even with me, with integration, I mean, even Dr. King, towards the end of his life, he said, I think I integrated my people into a burning house. And I think that we have to focus on the treatment of the Black community and treating us like we're citizens and not second-class citizens, so that we don't have to be mixed in with like the white community just for us to be treated right. No, we just treat it right because we're citizens and taxpayers like everybody else.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to move on to the second question. And Diana Carpio, who is,
Sorry, Are you going to allow people to talk to that question or just ask questions later?
Actually,
I think before we move on to the next topic. Okay. We can do that. Thank you.
Yeah, we encourage everybody to type in your question, so we'll be able to have the panelists to help.
Is there one in there?
There's no questions at the moment.
No.
Okay.
Make sure everybody knows what's happening. So if you have a question and you want to drop it in the chat.
Drop it in, right.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we said that, but it's good to say that again. If you do have a question, and Shelley is keeping tabs on that process. So thank you, Pastor Liz. So next we're going to move on to the second question. Diana Carpio, a Norwalk Board of Education member, will pose that question. Diana.
Good evening, everyone. So the question is, in the same vein of white supremacy and systemic racism, let's bring the conversation closer to home. Can you give us your picture of what Norwalk and Connecticut would be like without Black people?
I can't imagine it. And yet I think some people have blinders on and they live in their own little tunnel and they don't see outside of their own narrow world, and they don't consider that others might be disadvantaged, discriminated against, bullied, abused. People don't see it. And what I think James Baldwin's message, and I think the most important thing we get from The Fire Next Time, yes, it was written published in 1963, but everything that he advised in it, it's advice that applies to today. And he basically told us, as you were saying, Farah, we have all this history. We have to know our history. He told us, know whence you came, but don't just know your history, figure out how to use it, how to apply it, and start examining the history that is shared by all of us, and start to find what we have, the common ground, and acknowledge the obvious and systemic racism that most people are blind to because it makes them uncomfortable. They're afraid to admit it, and we don't grow without that.
So we're talking about Norwalk and Connecticut. What about, this whole entire country? This country without Black people would not be what it is today. And so I would imagine that would be true for every part of this nation, including Norwalk and Connecticut. I can't even think about a more righteous answer right now, what this world would be like without Black people. I would not exist here, right? That, like you're saying, right. Without Black people, I, myself, my person would not even be present in this space. And so that's just like, doesn't even make any kind of sense to me. So anybody else?
I was having that same thought, like, so are we, is it the Black people removed, or is it they were never here? And that's the difference. Like, there's a total difference if we're talking, are we talking a genocide, or were they, quote unquote, sent back to where they came from? As people say, like, it's a strange thing to think about in terms of what does it mean to not have somebody? Because if you don't have it, then you don't know what you're missing. But is it, if we've had them and our society is what it is, largely in part to their influence, then that changes, the society you have on a whole. And you can do that with every ethnicity. They all bring different aspects of themselves and who they are as people to a society. So without Black people, you have a different society in general. And is there even a white supremacy that is as rampant in that style? I don't know, because is it, the white supremacy came from the slavery, but that wasn't the only thing that was a white supremacy thing. They colonized the world. So I guess the in-depth is how much are we talking? Are we taking out everybody except white people? That's where, for me, it just like Pastor Liz was saying, it's a tough one to understand on what exactly it means to get rid of that, or is it them living in their own society within a society, and that changes the society. No, go ahead. I'm good.
So for like an alternate perspective, I would say and this is like not well thought out on my behalf, but I'm just gonna be transparent since we're in community. I would say there are parts of Norwalk where there are no Black people, or where Black folks have limited access, and where Black folks don't feel welcome. You know, there are certain places where I would be hard pressed to find someone else that looked like me in the room. And I find that astounding. But for example, I have this place in Rowayton that I love to go to called Farm Creek. Not sure if anybody's familiar with it, but it's a very small park in Rowayton. And I've never seen another person of color roam that space before. I went to visit the yacht club the other day because I have a friend who is a member. Everyone looked at me strange. There are certain places, if I walk into Bloomingdale's, I might not feel as comfortable as a neighbor walking into Bloomingdale's. If we look around our boardrooms and we look at the huge companies that are on Route 7, what do those rooms look like? So I would say there is a Norwalk without adequate representation. I'm not going to say there is a Norwalk without Black folks, because obviously, you know, we're free to go where we want. But I just think, like, on our small businesses board, how many people are represented that look like us? And I think there is a Norwalk where we're not welcome. There's the Country Club Norwalk. So while I am super proud to be of a diverse city like we are, I think it's not so hard to imagine.
I see Dr. Estrella is here, but I'm going to just say welcome. I see
I was on, but I was in the car, like on my phone, so I don't know if you could see me.
Well, we see you.
Thank you, Dr. Estrella. Oh, I can read the question. Thank you. So I introduced you, and Diane said she's coming, and so.
Oh no, I heard the question.
You heard the question, so
no,
please.
I've been here.
Okay, if you'd like to comment on that question.
So I mean, it kind of connects to a documentary that I had seen a while ago, and I don't remember exactly the name for it, but it was like America Without Mexicans, right? That a lot of times there's a lack of acceptance around diversity and being at the table, yet when you have to imagine what the world will be like without us, there's so many things that we do that people don't take into account that are crucial elements of other individuals' lives that they claim to be essential yet are not valued. So when I heard the question, it kind of made me think a little bit about that. And I think when someone mentioned the piece about going to Bloomingdale's and all of these other places and the lack of acceptance in those locations, in some cases, it doesn't even matter how you dress walking into those places. You're followed, there's a certain perception. And when you sit at the table, you always have to come in with people not acknowledging that you are there and only noticing you when they see that you bring value to the table. On the other hand, there's some people that come and sit at the table, they automatically acquire the value just because of the way they look, even if the content of what they're contributing has no value in the table. And I've seen that so many times, right? Where people of color are not acknowledged, and it takes them time to be valued even when they're sitting at the table, because it's an automatic belief that they have nothing to contribute until they demonstrate that they have something to contribute. But other individuals don't have to do that.
Can I ask some very important point, and it's something that we deal with, we go through on a daily basis.
I'd love to add something to that, because I think there wouldn't even be a table if it weren't for people of color. I think there's a wonderful thing on YouTube. It's the debate that James Baldwin participated in at Cambridge University back, I think, in 1965. And the debate was in honor of the students' 150th anniversary. And they decided, we want to have a really big deal. Let's have a really conservative American and James Baldwin debate each other on this particular question, which is, was America built on the backs of the American Negro? I'm paraphrasing, but that was the phrasing of the time. James Baldwin argued, obviously, that our economy, our celebrated American economy, would not be what it was. As I said, there wouldn't be a table to sit at if it weren't for the fact that slavery helped boost everybody's wealth and then made the country become a contender. And we've tried to deny that ever since, because it's embarrassing and it's painful, and it makes us not the great nation that we would like to portray ourselves as. So the good news is, at the end of that debate, the students had two doors, a yes door and a no door, and they had to file out in favor of whose argument, William Buckley's or James Baldwin's. And I think all but about 10 filed out the door in favor of James Baldwin. He was very persuasive, and you should watch that on YouTube. His debate is extraordinary.
I mean, I'm sorry.
I think too, like, because sometimes we talk about like the nation, and we talk about like the horrors of the nation, and it kind of seems like it's far away and it's not us. But like even right here in Norwalk, we talked about African Americans sitting at the table and their voices not being heard. We had 2 or 3 African American women on the Board of Education, who in a Latino, is Medallia Rivas, Rosa Murray, Sherelle Harris, and Shirley Mosby, who were on the Board of Education. They spoke up and they said, we aren't getting emails. They're holding meetings and they're letting me know 10 minutes before, or they're not letting me know. I don't know what's going on the board. They're holding meetings. They're not giving me information. And they said that, and nobody cared. They went to the Democratic Party in Norwalk and they said, this is happening. And nobody said anything. They actually used it and called them lazy, and they got them forced off of the Board of Education. And that happened right here in Norwalk. And right when it came out to light, when there was a lawsuit, and one of the president of the board, or the chairman of the Board of Education, he said in emails like, yeah, we don't send them emails. We don't give them information. And nobody brought that up, and nobody really focused on that. And we allow them, or people allow them, to be demeaned and treated as less than when they're elected officials to represent the children in the city. So it happens right here in Norwalk, where we have people who are in positions of power and elected officials who don't get treated with the respect that they should, because they aren't the people who are safe or in a certain clique, Democrat or Republican, and they don't get the respect that they should get. So that happens right here in Norwalk, where we have people, African Americans, who are at the table and just do not get the respect that they deserve, and they get forced out, and they get a sorry after it, but they've been kicked out of their positions because they've been forced out and lied about. So that happens right here in Norwalk, where people do not get the respect that they heard, and they're at the table and they're getting crumbs when they should be getting for a full course meal like everybody else.
If we just look back at the book, I don't know how many of you have your book with you, but in the book that the library was giving out, on page 29, Baldwin talks about meeting the pastor and finding out, who, she asked him, whose boy are you? And I think that reads or works right into this, that self-identity and where we fit into the larger fabric of every community and society. And if we are not able to, as Black people, able to identify who we belong to, even if it's, and I'll say God, but to each other, to this community, and claim it for ourselves, these type of incidents are going to always happen in our community. And when people, period, flood the streets in protest to raise their voice when they're no longer called riots, but just called protest because people's voices need to be heard, is the difference. And so my question to everybody here in a reverse, like, who do you belong to? Do we belong to each other in love for humanity, or is it still a us and them type of conversation that we're having? And where again do we all sit at the table? Like, is it a round table? Is it a square table? Is there somebody sitting at the head of the table? Somebody sitting, at the children's table? You know that children's table over there. Nobody has even a seat in the room. Me for one, I'll take standing room only if that's how I get in the room. And as you see, I'm gonna raise my voice.
I mean, I think we belong to each other. I think as a nation, we have the challenge of how, in many perspectives, this current government has been handling the conversation about being for each other, right? And when you have a president that puts forward an executive order that will prohibit funding to organizations that talk about implicit bias and discrimination, and talks about the challenges that we're facing as a nation about race, it brings us back to the same place that we were many years ago, and it puts me in a place of questioning how much have we grown as a nation, and also what are we willing to do collectively to make what's happened thus far better, right? Because just on the mere fact of what our leadership has done, and some of the prohibitions that have been set forward by some of the decisions from this administration, and the impact that that's going to have long term, the amount of healing that we have to do has set us back several centuries as a result of many of the things that are happening. I almost feel like deja vu. It's like we're going back in time rather than moving forward. So I think we should be we are all the children of each other. At least that's what we should be focused on.
I think that's, to me, I think that because that if we go that route, and I think that's the way that of course we should be going, but I think kind of like we could get into that love fest that we like talked about last time. It's easy like to like say like we should be for everybody, but like if you have a group of people who feel like nobody is for us, then you have like that us versus them type of mentality. And that's like I kind of feel like with James Baldwin, he said he talked to the 16-year-old boy and he said, "I have no country, I have no flag." And I felt that way. I was out trying to recruit people to vote, and people were like, "Vote for what?" Like I'm still in the hood. I've been making the same amount of money. My mom been living here for this, and what do I do? And it's just like I was that way with Obama, Bush, Trump. Like, what's Biden gonna do? What's voting for anybody gonna do? And it's like, how do you answer those questions when they feel that way? And when you feel like people aren't supporting you, like how do you support everybody else? When you feel like no one's supporting you. So the easy answer is to say, yes, we should belong to each other. But I think Black people, especially young Black people, and with the Black Lives Matter movement, there is turning to a part where it's how could we help ourselves, and how do we be for ourselves? How do we build Black businesses? Because they feel like they haven't got the help that they should get. So yes, the answer should be we're in it and we're children of each other. But the real answer for a lot of people that I've been able to meet is that they're in it for their community just because they feel like everybody else isn't for their community.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that real quick, so that is basically the idea of how you help change the system, right? So having a person in the highest position in the land that represents more of your moral standing is great. Good starting point. Awesome. That's great that happened. If that's, your belief, they have the same morality and humanity as you. But the key becomes just what you're saying. If despite whoever is in that top, and sometimes obviously it makes it a little more difficult if they're completely opposed to your views and your beliefs, but on the ground level where you can actually make changes for your community, when you find a group of like-minded people who are going to work together to move it forward, that is how you progress. And it's not always the easiest. You know, you have to reach across the proverbial aisle sometimes to grab hands with the person who may not always have the same belief as you, and maybe they didn't vote for the same person you voted for, but there's still a commonality once you get to have a conversation. So what we're doing right now is having that conversation. It's a moment where in order to understand somebody else's belief, you have to sit there and listen to them. And we don't do that enough on a mass scale, but start it at a smaller level. If we can continue to have this conversation with other people, whether they follow what we believe or not, it will at least allow us a starting point. And how can we come to an agreement and an understanding that we want the same thing, we're just talking about it two different ways. You're saying you may want it as I'll just use Republican and Democrat. You may want it as a Republican, but I may want the same thing as a Democrat. So why should that label necessarily be how we have to address it and get to that point? If we could just stop with a label for a moment and realize that, hey, I want to build a better community. You want to build a better community. What is it going to take to build a better community? So I think you're right in that terms of let's find ways to work through it in a community, and having conversation with all the people that are here right now is a great place to start and a great way to start.
That's great. Are there any other folks who are attending that want to jump in?
There is a question in the chat from Lakea Young. She says that. Okay, can you hear me?
Raven?
Yeah.
Raven, I think that might fall under the next question we're going to ask. And so maybe, so we
You
can
want to wait
relate
for that
it,
one?
yes, specifically to that.
Okay.
And then you can read that one, okay?
All right.
All right. So Shelley, is there anyone that looks like they have a question other than that one?
I think that's
Or
the
if you'd
only
like to
one.
raise your hand, maybe?
We just only, yeah, we just have that one now in the chat box. Feel welcome to put your comments or questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Any other comments from the panel on that last question? I think that was a great question, and it brought a lot of other issues to light, which was very insightful. So I'm going to jump in and ask this next question. So we cannot look at our future without looking at our youth. How do children of color learn about themselves in the context of history? Our superintendent of schools imagined that she was speaking to Mr. Baldwin and asked, why did you find it important to personalize history and the issues of Black expression in the United States in your book? And how can young adults utilize these experiences given today's realities? Can each of you speak to that, please?
I think it's important to note that James Baldwin himself was a teacher. He spent the latter years of his life, especially during a period when he was less successful in the eyes of the public, when he'd kind of been dropped out of the curriculum and his books were getting, oh, same old, he just complains, he's bitter. And so he, in that time, was invited to be a 5-college professor up at UMass Amherst, and he taught kids, and he also spoke at universities all over the country, got honorary degrees. But what he cared most about was the next generation. He cared deeply. And the beginning of The Fire Next Time, it's written to his nephew, but it's written to really to all young people. And we did a screening of our film in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where a teacher gave his class an assignment, and the assignment was to write after reading James Baldwin, the prologue to The Fire Next Time, the letter to my nephew, after reading that, he told his students, now write a letter that is to either your best friend or your sibling or your and some family member, and talk about what would it take? What do you need to do in order to survive in Bridgeport? And this was back in, I think, 2018. But in 2020, if we read what James Baldwin wrote to his then 14-year-old nephew, and we think about what it takes now, James Baldwin is telling us it takes love, and it takes, I think, what Pastor Liz and what everyone here has been saying, it takes a conversation, it takes acknowledgement, it takes the willingness to face a difficult past. And we don't need to just unify under this new administration. We need to unify around change.
So there's, when you look at what certain young adults have done in this country surrounding the George Floyd incident, so I'm going to use this as a through line. So there was the George Floyd challenge that came out after what happened to him. And for those of you who don't even know what the George Floyd challenge was, which I wish we didn't have to know, it's where they were pretending to be the cops and kneeling on another young adult's neck, just thinking that was a fun challenge to have. Okay, so they were separated from that incident, all right? So throughout the course of our history, there's a couple of things. We're not taught the entirety of our history, which then leaves us with gaps in it, and it leaves us with, like, what part of it do we trust? And it creates the backfire effect. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the backfire effect. It is a actual study that was conducted around misinformation. And so the backfire effect says that when you are taught something, when you're especially young, but when you're taught something and it's repeated to you, you start to believe it and it becomes part of your belief system. So when somebody presents information that is contrary to what you believe, you dig your heels in deeper and stick stronger to your point. So the best we can do with that is, as we get older, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So who do you go to teach these kinds of things? You have to go to the youth. You have to go to the children, because when you can teach them about it and give them a perspective that is all encompassing. So the same students who did the George Floyd effect, or the George Floyd challenge, obviously felt so separated from Black people that it was a moment they could use as enjoyment. But if they're starting to learn more about what it means to be any minority, to have an experience that can be oppressed at all, now it suddenly starts to resonate with them because they're taught this at a younger age. Their learning is pushed on them that, I don't say pushed on them, is taught to them that we all have these different experiences. And even if you're not experiencing something, you may now be able to have a person in your classroom that has experienced it. So I think it will also lead to students having conversations amongst each other. And as we look at what implicit bias is, I don't know if everybody knows that term, but it's the subconscious. We used to call it subconscious, but if it's subconscious, it means we're not going to deal with it at all. But when it's implicit, it just means it's a little bit hidden and we have to bring it to the forefront. And the more we can have conversation, the more we can teach children about it. And as we're teaching children, we're also learning ourselves. We're learning about these children. We're learning about things that we may not have been so lucky to learn along the way. And so now it's a teaching moment for everybody. And this, if we can continue that, then the young adults now are going to have a better chance of no longer wanting to have a George Floyd challenge. They're no longer going to want to think that that's fun, because there may be an actual connection to a real life person in their own life.
Do you all mind if I read the questions again? Because as I look at them, there were several in one in this. Is that okay, or you want to? So the one was, how do children, and thank you, Elijah, how do children of color learn about themselves in the context of history? And then why did James Baldwin find it important to personalize history and the issues of Black oppression in the United States in his book? And then how can young adults utilize these experiences given today's realities? And I think, Elijah, you were touching on that as well. I just wanted to say it again because it was a very long question.
Sorry for the long question. So I think that there are multiple layers. I think the author engaged in this in the conversation in his text because he himself, through the experiences that he was having, developed a notion of himself based on what the world perceived him to be. And I think when we look at curricula across the country in general, a lot of the conversation of people of color focuses on suppression. Children of color never learn about themselves in the context of queens and pharaohs and a lot of the greatness that happened in communities of color as the preface or initial conversation of their role in history over time. And when they do hear conversations about themselves in the context of history, like I articulated earlier, is always about suppression. One of the things that we have to consider as a nation, and in Norwalk as well, is how do we rethink what historical context and information we bring forward as important to the table when we speak about people of color, I think is one aspect of the challenge. I think too, it becomes very challenging for a predominantly white industry that education is, because when you look at the teaching staff or the people in front, even of children of color, it's predominantly white. And it takes people, individuals in education, to have a really clear vested interest to learn about the history of others to effectively teach the children that are in front of them. And until we, one, work in diversifying the teaching population to ensure that we have teachers in front of children that look like them and can understand the perspectives that they are experiencing as individuals of color, it becomes very challenging to bring to life the greatness and the beauty of the role that people of color have played throughout history, because it hasn't only been slavery. I think slavery is an important conversation to have, and some of the challenges that we've had as people of color in America, but it shouldn't be where the story begins. And even in the context of cartoons and the constant exposure, right? Because learning doesn't only happen in schools, it's also all these other factors that children are exposed to. And when you look at even Disney, where the main character of color is in the lens of serving and had to work hard to accomplish something, unlike many of the other characters, it constantly portrays a very consistent message for our children and the way that they see themselves. So to me, there's a lot of work to be done. One, in bringing people that look like the children, and that can bring diversity to the conversation around curricula and instruction. And two, we have to rethink how we talk about history in the context of the work. And it's not just in terms of history, I'm talking about everything. And even in the sciences, there have been great people of color doing great things, but are not the people that are highlighted or prefaced in the conversation of the science, mathematics, so on and so forth. So it's about reshaping how we think about the work and how we see people of color in the conversation of learning.
Great. I want to jump in on there because I think Dr. Estrella raised a lot of great points. and it leads me to think about the community and the church. What has happened to this third place that people used to go that people don't go to anymore? You had school or work and home, and then the church. And the church is become almost null and void, and we see that in the book that James Baldwin wrote. And that used to be where that learning used to go. You used to be able to see leaders who look like you. You used to be able to learn your history through this place that you would just spend your time with your family, with the people who lived with you. And when I say live with you, I mean in the community surrounding you. I created a rites of passage program called the Timothy Project, where I brought in men from the community and the church to talk to young males of color specifically about what it meant, what it took for them to become a man. And most of the men that participated said, I have never participated in anything like this. I didn't have anybody tell me how to become this gentleman or this man. I had to kind of figure it out for myself. And it's unless we have people of color educating our children, sharing our narrative, telling our story, it becomes really difficult for children to create their own narrative if they've never heard a narrative that includes people like them. So I commend Dr. Sheila for coming in here and doing the work already that she's done in the short time that she's been here, just since July, to just recognize this right away. And I thank God for being called to a time such as this, where these great leaders just sitting here on this panel are serving in a time and a capacity where we are able to share our narratives, especially in venues like this, where this is Facebook Live. Like, it's going beyond the walls of if we were just sitting together in the library, where people are able to hear educated people of color expressing their values on how we raise the nation, not just our community. So I thank all of you for being present.
I want to add to what Pastor Liz and what Dr. Estrella were talking about. And I want you to understand that there have been studies that are actually, you can read these studies, but it's not just beneficial to the students of color to have teachers of color as well. The studies prove that it's beneficial to all students, okay? So you may hear it, and there may be people who put up a barrier because they're like, oh, so you're just trying to get these, these minorities in these positions. And it's not just beneficial to those that look like the teachers. It's beneficial to all the students because, again, like Pastor Liz was saying, it helps show the story from not just a student. It helps to show the stories that have been lived by adults as well. So that continues that conversation that I was long-windedly mentioning before. Just wanted to add that in.
Right.
And I think
Jalen or Farrick, okay.
To the question of why did James Baldwin find it important to like address and speak to young people, I think that it's a conversation that like every Black parent has to have with their child. It's kind of like a rite of passage type of thing. Like, you have to have that conversation. This is what you do when you get stopped by the police. Like, you're gonna be followed around the store. If you go into a store, like, it's just that conversation that we have is something that's kind of like passed down. People had the conversation with me about like different things and what it's like to just grow up being Black. It's kind of like a disclaimer type of thing. Like, this is how you deal with it. And this is what you should do because you want to come home. So I think it's kind of that same conversation that like Black people been having for a long time. And also it's a good thing to talk to the youth because, like, a lot of times once people become adults, I don't want to say they're lost, but it's like it's hard. They have their opinions and everything. But talking to the youth, that's where we can really make that difference. And that's the next generation coming up. And it's also important for the ties for the elders to talk to the youth, to pass on that information and those stories and everything. And that's something that doesn't happen as much as it should. So connecting with the elders and the young people, that's gold right there. And that's passing on wisdom and not just the stuff that we could find in the books.
Great. Raven, do you want to ask that question?
Okay, so the first question in the chat is from Lakea Young. She says that Fairfield County has the largest disparity among Black and Brown children in education funding. And she wants to know, what are the next steps to improve our children's education now that we have the new supervision of the new superintendent?
So I think in the context of NPS, I don't know if everyone knows, but we're in the process. We started to engage in equity project, which encompass community conversations as well as conversations with different constituents within the organization. We've conducted a number of surveys to assess and get a deep sense of what are the disparities within the community, how the community has experienced those disparities, and what are the things that they're looking to see change as we develop the new strategic operating plan for the next 5 years. So right now we're in the midst of basically what I would call discovery, which is just having ongoing conversations across the different groups in the community so that we get a deeper sense of what people have seen and experienced so that we can make an informed decision of what we need to do moving forward.
Anyone else want to?
I know of a number of towns in Fairfield County that their consciousness perhaps crystallized when what happened to George Floyd hit their hearts and minds. But in Easton, where I live, we have a new school superintendent who is also actively trying to, he's a person of color, and he is listening to various task forces which have been formed. We too are in a process of discovery. And I know this is true. There are task forces in a number of towns where people are actively trying to talk about police accountability or curriculum or representation. I would recommend another book, not just James Baldwin's, but a book about James Baldwin by Eddie Glaude, and it's called Begin Again. And he believes that there is a spiritual possibility of, despite everything that is bad, taking our strength and using it, putting it to good avail. And obviously, Dr. Estrella, you're doing that right now. So I hope that it bears fruit.
I think Princeton Theological School is actually doing a book talk on that book next week. If I can find the link while we're here, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you.
A wonderful book.
So I think, Shelley, I see someone's hands up. Miss Lyra?
I'm not sure if this is appropriate, but the thought is running through my mind. If we are talking about trying to get the races to come together so that we can stamp out racism and discrimination and all of that, I don't know how successful we would be for adults to learn that now. And what I mean is for a white person to truly understand and be able to integrate with a person of color. First you had segregation, then you had desegregation, and as one of the speakers mentioned, the schools that were white with a few blacks are now all blacks because of movement of people, whites moving out of neighborhoods, etc. So isn't it, or can't we help solve the problem if from early kindergarten you have children, whites, blacks, Asian, whichever, growing up together? And I think that that is one of the ways to solve this segregation problem. I don't know it. My background is not American. So I don't know segregation as it is. I don't know racism. I don't know discrimination from my youth. I may experience some of it now as an adult coming here. So if children were growing up with each other, can they help adults to learn? So that when a child goes home and tells the mother, John is my friend, when a white child goes home and tells the mother, John is my friend, and she says, or she finds out John is black and she wants to say, what are you doing with John? She said, no, he is my friend. He is a good person. He does this, he does that. He understands, he plays with me. He helps me. When I cry, he is there for me and things like that. Isn't this one way that we could begin to re-educate the different races? The same way a black person may tell their child, you're not supposed to play with a white child because you have nothing in common. These are just ideas I am throwing out. I don't have the references to back them up, so to speak. But I think that perhaps that is something that we can look at least the idea. We can begin to see it and think about it and see how we could move with it. Not just in Norwalk, but the whole country, because children very often teach us things and they teach us to see things differently.
Thank you, Ms. Lyra. Does someone want to answer that, respond to that?
I think just for me, racial harmony, with like not having the racist acts or the racist comments, that's part of the goal. But one of the biggest things, like Malcolm X said, like if someone sticks a knife in my back and it's in like 9 inches and they take it out 3, that's not progress. It's not progress till they take it out. Even if they take it out, it's not progress. They got to heal and mend the wound. So we have racial harmony where you have people where we don't have these incidents of cop killings or incidents in the school. That's one thing, but we have like systematic oppression that's been here. Like even when America became suburbanized and you had suburbans coming up, you had the Federal Housing Administration that put clauses in these loans that say you can't sell these houses to Black people. And then they also say you can't rent these houses to Black people. And then of course you can say, okay, that's just a racist act. But at the time when they sold those houses, it was about $10,000. At that time, anybody really could buy a house if you had a full-time job. Then those people went on to sell those houses for like $100,000 or more. So they built wealth, and they had wealth that was built up from there. And African Americans couldn't take advantage of that. Even when you look at the school systems, when you had the Cold War, America was scared, and they put a whole bunch of money into schools, and they said we got to educate our kids because we got to get ahead of the Russians. We got to get ahead, and they didn't let African Americans go to the school. So you had people who were given things by the country to just go ahead, and that's not even touching slavery and the setback of 400 years of free labor that we gave. But you had like we were held down and left back. So even like the racial harmony is great, but we have to become equal, and we have to have that equity in these spaces, because even if we're all sitting at the table, but we own like 0.5% of America when it comes to everything. And I think that's where the true equity and racial harmony that can happen, but we have to make up for the loss in this community, because we could talk about integration and everything, but if our community isn't starting to be built up and start to be healed for the damage that was done, then yeah, we might not be called racial slurs or mistreated in the school system, but we're still like victims of oppression, of history of oppression, maybe not by the current administration, but by things that we're still feeling today.
Thank you, Jalen. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Okay.
Okay.
There is just
Yes.
another question in the chat. This one is from Paul Reiter. He says equal school resources and integrated schools are important, but because of our country's long-standing systematic racism, we have a large economic divide where the result is the wealthy families are more equipped at home to support schools educational efforts. This, excuse me. This includes more parental hands-on support because more parental free time from not having to work multiple low job wages, and more parental knowledge of how to support their children's education because of their own success in education and the support they received / experience along the way. The question is, how can our country support low-income parents so that they can be better support their children at succeeding in school? Increasing minimum wage is part of the answer, but that's not the long-term solution. Are there other things we can do for more immediate results?
So I'll hop in. So when I'm creating ministry and program and I see that there's a clear disparity between the kids that are represented, I search for different ways in which I can fill those gaps and fill the voids. For instance, Cornerstone has had a long-standing Boy Scout troop, BSA troop, for 90 years this year, and that's a great accomplishment. When I came to the church, my daughter became the only Black person there. And when I thought about, well, why wouldn't other Black kids come to this troop? It's been here forever. Parents are working at night, or they're not there at night to bring their kids to spend this hour to more so with persons of color than not. And so it requires us to tap into community resources, individuals who have the time, who are willing to support or create or move the program so that it actually fits these families' schedules. So it's being in tune to the needs of the family, and serving their kids. And parents can't always show up. I'm sure this is something that Dr. Estrella has seen with like PTAs. When you look at who sits on the governance committees, it probably isn't always persons of colors because the schedule would not necessarily fit our schedule. And so how do we change that? It's creating situations where we can meet the children where they are with the permission of their parents and keeping our children safe, because that has been the other issue, right? Where we've had community people prey on our young people in these vulnerable situations when they haven't had adequate supervision. So it's really being mindful, being available to create space and time to meet the kids where they are, with their parents' permission, building trust in our communities. It takes a community to build a village, and the truth in that has been lost because of this violence that has happened to our young people when there has not been adequate supervision. I hope that made some sense.
I think too, another part of it, other than like the parents not having time, is that like I know that people make time for what they know and feel is important. And I think that just doing the outreach to show these people the value of that, a lot of parents I know I spoke to, that they feel like after a certain grade, like the kid is on their own and it's the school system's job to like handle that part. Even though that's not true, I think we just need to do a job to make it important. And I think people are going to reach out, and also making people feel welcome to sit on PTOs and SECs, and making sure that people know what they are. I think a lot of times we have these abbreviations and we talk at people and people have no idea what this stuff is. And they're just like, well, I'm not even going to apply for that because I don't even know what that is and what they do. And I think sometimes we don't realize, because we're in these spaces and we know what these things are, that we sometimes parents don't know. And even though, yeah, I put a note in the kid's backpack, a lot of times that stuff doesn't get to parents. I know when I was a student, my mom didn't get anything. I was scared that I was going to get in trouble because I was a pretty bad student. So we gotta just look at that and be honest. And it's not just Black parents or Latino parents, it's just all parents. They're working. Fairfield County isn't cheap to live here. So people are working and they're busy. They want to spend time with their children. You got a lot of stuff going on, and we have to make it important. And make it something where people don't have to sit and spend too much time because their time is valuable.
I think for the schools is thinking about the work beyond the classroom and understanding that the schools encompass the response. They're more than just what happens on a day-to-day basis in terms of what happens in a classroom, but beyond that, thinking about how do we support our families and have a more of a community school-based mindset, that we should think about a well-rounded approach of providing services, especially because we have so much diversity within the schools. And I'm not talking about ethnicity alone, but I'm talking about socioeconomic and need. And sometimes we don't, make many assumptions about a child in terms of behavior and other factors that might be directly correlated to life experiences that we can find other partners within the communities to support. And really seeing ourselves as the hub where we can have many tentacles across the community to really provide children and families with a robust set of services that will support and meet their needs, and provide them with access and understanding about what's out there to help them, especially during difficult times.
And we need to reach out to the gatekeepers, the people who have white skin and who don't have to go through all of this. They are woefully uninformed and less impacted and therefore less motivated. And James Baldwin said, if you can change the way people see reality, even by a millimeter, then you can change reality. And so all of us in our various fields, if we continue to reach out and express the thoughts that are being shared here, just by beginning that conversation and getting people to see a slightly different version of the reality that they've been so comfortable with, then our identities will evolve and more doors and windows will open.
Thank you. So I'm going to do something that might be a little out of the norm here. I see Nancy Meany and Diane Carpio. And so I know that both of you are very engaged with the school system. And so I'd just like to hear your perspective to speak a little bit more to what's been said and Dr. Strella's comments. You're on mute. Can you unmute her, Shelley?
Well, yes.
Nancy.
Still muted.
Yeah, I just asked her to unmute herself.
Nancy? Unmute yourself, Nancy.
Okay, here I am. Hi, everybody. Well, my children went to Columbus Magnet School, so I was, let's see, I'm trying to think of who was, it was Lyra, who was making comments about the way forward that she thought would be helpful for kids of all different colors and stripes and nationalities to go to school together. And I couldn't agree more with that. But I also realize, having lived in Norwalk for a long time, that it does rub up against this notion that that I also think is important, which is if you're in your neighborhood, being able to go to your own school. So I think sometimes those are two forces that don't always match together, and some judgments need to be made about how to accommodate both of those things. Because we have certain areas, not everything is going to change at the same time. We have to figure out a way to move forward on a lot of different fronts. So, for instance, in South Norwalk, we have more people of color. And is it fair that some of those children need to be, bussed out to another school? So I'm not really sure what the answer is, but I can tell you that the experience that I felt, and I feel like my kids had, and was incredibly valuable to be raised in a school with a very just rich, and by the word rich, I mean diverse, wonderful array of people. And the themes were centered around respect and understanding different cultures and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to say it was perfect, but I think that there was a lot of presence of families and parents there, so you would have an opportunity to integrate with a lot of folks. And there's some people that are on this call right now that I've literally known for decades, right? Darlene, you're one person, you know, who I've known for a really, really long time, and I can't imagine. It's made my life so much fuller to know people from all, you know, all different parts of Norwalk, all of these years. And I can say that my kids have really benefited to this day. Now they're in their 30s and in their 20s, and they still talk about. I think they had a really good early start.
Thank you, Nancy. Diana?
Hi, everyone. Well, for me, I started thinking and volunteering at a very young age only because of the communication gaps. My household was always full with someone at the kitchen table that either needed help with translation, paperwork for immigration, and things like that. And as I lived in South Norwalk, and again, because there was no school in South Norwalk, my father worked 3 jobs and my mom worked 2 jobs in order to be able to put us through St. Joseph's, which is the only other school at that time in South Norwalk. So seeing that and how that affected us as a family, and knowing that there still isn't a school, a neighborhood school, you know, that bothers me a lot. And I want to be able to sit at that table and have those types of conversations. And at the same time, because I volunteer and I'm at a lot of different events, I ask people questions. I talk to different families, to different members, to different council people, to the mayors, police chiefs. For me, it's about education, not only for myself so that I can learn and how I can help others, but also the education to the families. Like Jalen said, there's a lot of times where people don't understand how they can help, or what the PTA stands for, or any of the other groups that they can actually be able to be involved. And even if they're working and they cannot be at those meetings, that doesn't mean that they can't reach out to someone like myself or another parent that they've already met and feel comfortable enough to speak to be able to give their concerns where I can carry it back. Now, being on the Board of Education, I've been on it for a year, and in that year alone, I've been able to meet so many more families, speak to many parents, students, staff members, and talk about racism within the board. Like Jalen said, I mean, I myself have experienced a lot of differences on the board. I have to stand strong on what I believe and what I feel that every child should have. You know, the exact same resources. It doesn't matter if you're from Rowayton, South Norwalk, you know, anything like that. So this year we're going to have a lot of challenges coming up. I know that Dr. Estrella has put a plan together, and I plan on being there and being supportive of her and her decisions, because I know that we've had very detailed conversations about every child in Norwalk, and it doesn't matter who, what, when, and where, but every child should be supported and be able to have a very good education. I, on the other side too, have been working with parents and educating them on the resources that they have. Coming from the medical field, I would always have conversations with parents in the hallway asking me, how do I get help for my child for this? How do I get help for my child for that? So there is so much information that parents don't have that we need to be able to get that out and spread the word, and know that every child should have that opportunity. Every family shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. The whole idea of safety in school too, where the kids are afraid, you know, now with COVID, not so much, but right before COVID and after Sandy Hook, the whole conversation of safety in school, who do I talk to? The security guard, do I speak to them? Can I speak to them? You know, they see that it's a Caucasian security guard and you're not comfortable going up to that security guard. So there's just so many little details that I think little by little, if we all work together as a community, like I've been wanting to sit down with different members of Norwalk and listening to them and taking down the information. And like I said, for myself, learning so that I can take back and ask those questions and push for certain things. And again, it's a very trying time right now because we're all behind closed doors, but we do have a lot of work to do, and I'm willing to work with that.
Thank you, Diana. And so I see Colin Huston's face, who's also a board member, and maybe you'd like to chime in, Colin?
Hi, yes, and hi everybody, and I apologize. I was here at the beginning. I had to leave for a meeting at 7 and that ended and I came back. So I don't know if there's a particular prompt we're chiming in response to, or?
So there was a question I'll ask. Are there, one of the attendees asked, are there things we can do? I'm trying to get a better sense. How can our country support low-income parents so they can better support their children at succeeding in school? That's one question. Increasing the minimum wage is another part of the answer, but that is no longer the solution. Are there other things we can do for more immediate results?
Wow, that's a good question. Yes, well, I think the operative word there is immediate, because what we're finding with these disparities is they are the result of centuries of deliberate discrimination, right? So these aren't a mistake. I always say this is not a bug, it's a feature, right? It's meant to hold some people down. So yeah, clearly the long term is to address systemic inequality, in housing, in employment, in policing and so on. That's much larger than the public schools can do, although the public schools have a large role in it as well. On the shorter term, I think that one of the answers that I try to pursue is kind of like what Diana was saying, which is to kind of approach it as a full court press, right? To sort of see, and I heard Jalen say this at the very beginning, to see what we're doing in public education as part of the fulfillment of this sort of mythic promise of America, this idea that that this country is for everybody, right? It's kind of been an idea, not so much a practice, but to see that as something that we all have a stake in. And I'll give you an example. When we talk about this education gap, income inequality, when we talk about closing the gap, people often say that it's for the benefit. We have to help those who are lower income. We have to help those who are from minority families and who have not had the same opportunities. And of course, that's true. But I think it's important to remind people that when we address the education gap, when we make that a focus, we are equally helping a kid who grew up in Cranberry and who has had a much easier life, right? But whose life is actually deficient because of a lack of exposure to different ways of thinking, right? We cannot see this as, this part of the school helping that part of the school. We're all in it together, and if some of us are not achieving at our full potential, then none of us are, right? So that's, I think, I think the way that we can get some immediate traction on this is by not seeing it as something that only affects people from lower incomes.
Thank you, Colin. So in the interest of time, because I think we can just go on and talk and talk and talk about so many things, we are entering on the last question, and in the nick of time, Council Member Greg Burnett has joined us, and he will ask the last question. And he was at another meeting, and as we said in the beginning, there's so many of us who are so busy and have so many things to do, but he just made it. And so, Greg, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Darlene. And I'm sure that you've been having some great and insightful discussion and sharing of your thoughts. So as we close out this great part two of the conversation, the question that I'd like to pose is the following. And especially for those that are in the audience, if you can turn your books to page 105, which is the last page before the close of the book. And the passage that we want you to focus on is the very last piece that states, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do we falter in our duty now? We may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. So with that passage, the final question is, what decisions do we need to make about our call to action in answering the question, where do Blacks go from here in the United States? Who would like to start with a response to that?
Could I ask a question in response to that question?
Sure.
My question would be to Jalen and to Jalen and to everyone here. What is it that turned all of you into such incredibly important change makers within this community? What happened in your youth that compelled you to become who you are now and active in the way you are now? And how can we expand that to create more of you?
Well,
let me just say that is almost a question 5 in itself. That's a huge question. So if you can address your answer in the context of the original question, which is where do we go from here in the United States, that would be greatly appreciated.
So for me, I got involved because I pretty much had to, and I was given all of the resources and all of the connections to become involved. I met Miss Darlene at a very young age, Miss Harris at a very young age. And my cousin is Travis, so I'm kind of a different animal because I was so well connected. Miss Anita, who was the president of NAACP, I was lucky enough to be connected with her. But I saw the need for change. I saw that things weren't going the right way, the way that I grew up. I saw that we needed positive role models. And I heard the call for action to be taken. And I believe that a lot of young people are hearing that call for action and they're acting on it. I think, where do we go from here? I believe that we have the elders and we have people that reach out and grab these young people, give them the wisdom that we have, and we allow them to grow and do what they are called to do. I think we have a lot of energy that's here, and I think the action that has to take place is right now. Even a lot of people in the audience, they feel that now is the time for change to happen. We have this perfect storm of COVID-19, this president that we have current, and we see that change needs to happen right now. So the answer is, what do we do? It's not just, you don't just tweet about it, you don't just vote, but you get involved, you do your part, and you find your niche in this society and how you can help. Even if it's just a conversation, you have that conversation with people, but you do what you can to push the society forward. And I believe the original question was, where do Blacks belong in America? And I think that we don't belong anywhere. We just belong here. So we don't belong in a certain part of society. We just belong in America. We are Americans, and we belong to be treated as Americans.
Thank you, Jalen. Who would like to respond next? I see Pastor Liz unmuted her mic. You're up.
I was trying to give Elijah his opportunity to jump on in there. Thank you, Mr. Burnett. You know, both of those questions are so loaded for me. And when we first, as a panel, came together to talk, we actually started with this question. And it is, you know, one of my favorite passages of the text. I struggled a lot with this book, with how he talks about the church, of course, but also by the time we got to this point, a lot of that was resolved with him for me. As a child, when I was asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, all I knew was I wanted to change the world. And as I grew up, if I could change it for one person at a time, or if I could change one person's perspective on the world, then I've changed their world. And I feel like that has been my beating mantra, the drum beat that keeps me moving. So many of you know that I'm a little girl from the Bronx who was appointed through the United Methodist Church to Norwalk in July of 2019. And I think the very first thing that happened was the shootings that were happening in Oklahoma. And oh no, it was Children on the Border, and there was a prayer vigil. And I stood out there and I ran into you, Councilman Burnett, and I was like, well, where's all the clergy? You know, here's a prayer vigil, where's the clergy? And you looked at me, you looked around, and was like, okay. And then right after that was the shooting in Oklahoma, and Senator Majority Leader, Senator Duff called me. I was like, Pastor, I need you to come with Rabbi Ida and do the benediction. And I was like, wow, I'm here, you know. And then this summer was George Floyd, and everything just unraveled after the COVID-19. And I knew that my voice could no longer be silent. We oftentimes say, you know, I'm too small, I'm not enough to say or to do. So if I wasn't doing it before, I'm gonna do it now, and I'm gonna make sure that those who feel like they don't have a voice, or who need someone to speak on their behalf, to be there. So if I have to say, where do Blacks belong in the United States, and to truly answer that question, we belong everywhere. You know, we belong in every crevice of this country and the world. And for every person on this call who is conscious of who they are, you have been made for a purpose, and do everything you can to live fully in it. You have been equipped. Yesterday equipped you for today, and today equips you for tomorrow, and just live that fully. One of the things that I even had to, me of all people, I had to take off my lampshade and proclaim that I'm going to let my little light shine as far as it can go. And if it touches one person on this call today, then I've done my due diligence, and I've served my purpose. So press on.
Where do we go from here? What would your thoughts be on that?
Let your light shine. Like,
okay.
It would really be who you were created to be made. Like, for me, like, we all have a role in our life. We all have gifts. We all have passions. Do that. Like, do it unapologetically in living who you are. If you're an educator. That's not, educate. That doesn't mean that's your job, right? So what you do for a living isn't necessarily who you were created to be. Be who you were created to be unapologetically. And that's a lifelong quest. So ask the questions of yourself. And I know, like, Representative McGee had a lot more to say for this. I'm really sorry that he's not able to join us today. But I think Be who you were created to be, and ask every question you can so that you can help somebody else.
Thank you, Pastor Liz. I think Elijah, I'm not sure if he just blanked out, wanted to say something, or Farah.
I can jump
Elijah,
in.
go ahead.
To the original question, I know that Black people belong everywhere, that there is power in our country. I am so proud that Kamala Harris will be our vice president. I am so proud that we are moving forward, although we know we're not perfect, but we're striving to be more perfect, like Barack Obama has said continuously. So I'm excited to continue to see Black people, Black women, Black men, Black trans folks in positions of power. And I think that's where we are moving forward. And I am excited that Black women especially are being given their props. They carried the Democratic election. They've carried, you know, our nation really, and have been, you know, silenced for far too long. So I'm very excited about that. And then to answer Karen's question, I'm a Norwalk native. I grew up in Norwalk Public Schools, and I did not have a person of color as an educator until I was in middle school. So I spent my most formative years as a child as a sponge, not seeing anyone that looked like me in positions of power or leadership, because I did go to school with folk at Merrimack, and I was very excited and knew plenty of people from different cultures, but I didn't see anybody in leadership. So I didn't ever think, you know, I could be a teacher. I never thought I could be a social worker or a principal or the superintendent. So I see Dr. Estrella, and I'm so proud and excited for our next generation who gets to see themselves in Dr. Estrella. I wouldn't call myself an activist, but I would call myself someone committed to healing in our community, in our country, in our community specifically as people of color. I'm a social worker by trade. I'm called to healing. And I think my real purpose is to honor my ancestors, my Black and my Indigenous ancestors. So I've been doing stuff in New York City, and, you know, it wasn't until George Floyd died that I really hyper-focused on Norwalk and in my roots, and joined the NAACP, and really have been paired up with Jalen and kind of learning about all of the intertwined politics that exist in Norwalk that I had no idea about. So I'm super thankful to this community, Pastor Liz, Elijah, Jalen, for really guiding me and helping me out in this.
Great. So Elijah, I think you want to answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so many parts to the question. The part of what draws me to where I am is a question that I still don't have an answer to. I don't think I ever thought about it in terms of like, how can I affect change the best way? I thought it more of like, less of a question, more of a, I need to help. I need to find a way to help people, to bring about conversation, to spark people to realize that there is so much more than just this George Floyd incident. And, you know, for years I had always been, you know, wanting to do something, and I hadn't. And I finally was like, what am I doing? Why am I not acting on what I feel? And I don't know what was holding me back, but I realized I won't let whatever it was hold me back any longer. And the first thing I did was I wrote a speech. One thing you'll learn about me is I love to write. And I wrote a speech, and I had no intention of actually going anywhere and doing it. I wrote it because it was things that were in me that I needed to get out. And I ended up saying it at the first protest here in Norwalk. And, you know, it was I called it "It's Not the Story You're Told," and it was all about, you know, these moments that we've talked about continuously, how people don't know these things, and like, wow, why did we not learn this? And I realized that, okay, people at least are listening to me. I have more to say. I'm gonna keep saying it until people stop listening. And so far, nobody stopped listening, and I still have more to say. I'm not gonna stop. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to know that there are people who are interested in hearing what I have to say and who are willing to listen and have a conversation with me. And that, I think, is the most important. That I could have a conversation with myself, which I've done numerous times, but until I start having people have a conversation with me, it doesn't go anywhere. So there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So that's where we are. That's where Black people are in this country. We are going together. And it's not mean just together as Black people. It means together with the country that we are a part of. We are part of this just as much as anybody else. You know, we have our blood, sweat, and tears is all over the land, just like everybody else. And it's not even a recognition thing that needs to happen. It's a come here and join the march forward thing. It's, yeah, this is for all of us. And the only way we're ever going to have the true ending, if there is such a thing, or at least the true harmonious moment, is if we all continue to strive forward together and stop looking at each other as others and start saying, hey, you're a different part of me. Because we all have different parts of ourselves in everybody. It's just, we have all the gamut of personality through us. It's just about finding that part within us that connects to somebody else.
Thank you, Elijah. So I think, Jalen, did you answer that question?
Yes, he did. I think Dr. Estrella.
With the first one. And Dr. Estrella, you'd like to answer that?
So the way I see it is more about making sure that we all come to the table and walk this path together. We can't do it by ourselves. And when I think about change has to be just beyond Black and brown. It has to be making sure that other people see the need for all of us to succeed and not feel that it's important to hold on to power or aspects of entitlement that have kept some at the top and others suppressed. It's really seeing the value in uplifting everyone. In terms of the work moving forward, I think in an at the instructional capacity or the educational capacity, it's really rethinking how we engage education. How do we highlight and embrace a more culturally diverse curricula so that all children can see themselves in the work, and that we don't continue to suppress children by creating an image of themselves that doesn't uplift them or empower them to greatness.
Darlene, you're muted.
So thank you, Dr. Estrella. And so Greg, I was just saying, you just got on and you asked the last poignant question. And so maybe you have an answer for that, because some of the other folks who asked the questions have answered. We've got a few minutes.
Wow.
I mean, I put you on the spot, but
no, and that's fine, and that's great. That's great. I mean, you know, one of the things that I found so interesting from the first discussion, by just reading this book by Baldwin, it prompted me to look at other things that he has done, and one of the statements that he either acquired or he's used quite often is the one that, you know, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And I find that statement so compelling, especially in this present situation, this, you know, point in our country where we do have disagreement. However, we can agree to disagree. And as we go forward, we have to find that space. We have to find that part of us that says, yes, we disagree, but we all have something of value. We all have something we can contribute. And I love the statement that Elijah made related to, going forward together. There's we can go so much further if we go along this path together. So there will be individuals that have to look at themselves in the mirror and say, how can I make a difference? And there's individuals that will have to look themselves in the mirror and say, how can I be part of that difference? And where is my place? Where is my space to contribute to make things better for everyone? It's not going to happen overnight, but we have to start somewhere. And I think this somewhere starts now.
Thank you, Greg. Ms. Thornton, do you have anything you'd like to say as we wrap up? We're at 8:25.
Oh my, I'm honored to be part of this group. And I didn't say in the beginning, and I wish I had, that I grew up in South Norwalk. And I had activist parents who did not have money. They had ideals, but they somehow managed to come up with a system where they would rent summer houses in the winter and winter houses in the summer, and we lived rather well. And one of the places that I grew up was Wilson Point, and that was a privileged neighborhood that was not only all white, but it was, if you were Jewish, you couldn't get a property there either. And my parents were very vocal about that and made a point of taking me out and being part of South Norwalk and attending churches in South Norwalk and being part of the community. And obviously what our parents did has affected all of us. And it affected me to the point where when it came time for the first book I read of James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son, it was when the Vietnam War had tarnished America, and I had the opportunity of going on a junior year abroad in France. So I came back from France, I read James Baldwin. He was writing about how he went to France because he was bothered by what his country was not doing for him and was doing to him. And I was a white girl, straight, and he was a gay black male, and yet I saw he was writing about the stuff that mattered to me. And I've been reading him ever since, and he has given us, all of us, a message to follow. So my story is very directly tied to South Norwalk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And just in listening to that last question, and Pastor Liz, you I think the question was, where do we belong? Do Black people belong? And I wrote it here, we belong everywhere. And you said that. And one of the things that I think about and comes to mind is that my dad used to say that there's nothing new under the sun, and that history repeats itself. And so in 2020, we are at an inflection point in our history again. And so the biggest thing right now is what and how we will change the world. And this is going to determine decades of how we interact, of where we're going to be. And so it starts, I think, with having conversations like these, and to continue the conversations with folks who may not necessarily agree with us, but we have to have these conversations because, we're divided. We are a nation divided, and we have to come together somehow. And Jalen, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to because it seemed like I broke up the love fest sometimes. But it's not that I don't want this love fest and everything, but I don't want to just feel good. I want us to be good. I want us to just be good. I want us to not just for a moment we feel like we're hugging and everything. I wanted us to be loved and be loved. Not just for a moment and not just for a second. And I think sometimes that means having these hard situations. And I think, like I said in the last conversation, to have a real honest conversation and to really be accepting and inviting, and for us to be together, we have to be honest about the stuff that is happening and have a conversation about it and address it. And that's really, I just want us to be good and move forward. But for us to move forward, we have to be honest with each other about what's happening, what's happening.
Thank you, Jalen. So I think we did good, Shelley. It is 8:29, folks. So in my closing remarks, so on behalf of Sherelle, who I know really wanted to be here, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending this important discussion. And as I said earlier, I heard so much about the first one, and the fact that you all wanted to come back and do this again just shows that this is something that really needs to be done. And I applaud all of you. So Sherelle says to stay tuned for more book discussions. And on December 7th, the Norwalk Public Schools students will debate the Electoral College. So you check out the website for the email blast and for more information. And I just wish you all to stay well and as safe as you possibly can, and to have a good night. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
It was an honor.
Good night.
All right.
Hey, Lyra.
Good meeting. Thanks.
Good. Thank you for coming. Hi, Nancy. I see you there.